The Cabinet of Australia is the executive branch of the Government of Australia and is the council of senior ministers of the Crown, responsible to Parliament. Ministers are appointed by the Governor-General, on the advice of the Prime Minister, who is the leader of the Cabinet. Cabinet meetings are strictly private and occur once a week, where vital issues are discussed and policy formulated. The Cabinet is also composed of a number of Cabinet committees focused on governance and specific policy issues. Outside the Cabinet there is an outer ministry and also a number of assistant ministers, responsible for a specific policy area and reporting directly to a senior Cabinet minister of their portfolio. The Cabinet, the outer ministry, and the assistant ministers collectively form the full Commonwealth Ministry of the Government of the day. As with the Prime Minister of Australia, the Constitution of Australia does not recognise the Cabinet as a legal entity. These roles actually exist solely by convention. Decisions of Cabinet do not in and of themselves have legal force. Instead, it convenes to function as a practical foreshadowing of the business of the Federal Executive Council, which is, officially, Australia's highest formal governmental body established by Chapter 2 of the Constitution of Australia. In practice, the Federal Executive Council meets solely to endorse and give legal force to decisions already made by the Cabinet. All members of the Cabinet are members of the Executive Council, whereas the nominal presiding officer, the Governor-General, almost never attends Executive Council meetings. A senior member of the Cabinet holds the office of Vice President of the Executive Council and acts as presiding officer of the Executive Council in place of the Governor-General. Until 1956, Cabinet comprised all ministers. The growth of the ministry in the 1940s and 1950s made this increasingly impractical. And in 1956, Liberal Prime Minister Robert Mingus created a two-tier ministry, with only senior ministers being members of Cabinet, while the other ministers are in the outer ministry. This practice has been continued by all governments since, with the exception of the Whitlam government. When the non-Labour parties have been in power, the Prime Minister has advised the Governor-General on all Cabinet and ministerial appointments at his own discretion, although in practice he consults with senior colleagues in making appointments. When the Liberal Party and its predecessors have been in coalition with the National Party, the leader of the junior coalition party has had the right to nominate his party's members of the coalition ministry, and to be consulted by the Prime Minister on the allocation of their portfolios. When the Labour Party first held office under Chris Watson, Watson assumed the right to choose members of the Cabinet. In 1907, however, the party decided that future Labour cabinets would be elected by members of the Parliamentary Labour Party, the caucus, and this practice was followed until 2007. The Prime Minister retained the right to allocate portfolios. In practice, Labour Prime Ministers exercised a predominant influence over who was elected to Labour cabinets, although leaders of party factions also exercised considerable influence. Under two-tier ministerial arrangements introduced in 1987, each senior or portfolio minister was a member of the Cabinet. In 1996 this was modified by the Howard government, whereby two portfolio ministers, one being the Attorney General, were not members of Cabinet, and one portfolio had two Cabinet ministers. In subsequent Howard ministries, and the 2007 Rudd Labour Ministry, all portfolio ministers were in the Cabinet. Before the 2007 election, Kevin Rudd announced that if Labour won the election he would dispense with this tradition and appoint the ministry himself. In fact, the caucus rule requiring the election of ministers remains in place. At the first caucus meeting after the election, Rudd announced the members of his chosen ministry, and the caucus then elected them unopposed, thus preserving the outward form of caucus election. In a parliamentary context, the Cabinet is of little procedural consequence, its relationship to Parliament being similar to the relationship between the ministry as a whole and Parliament. It is fundamentally an administrative mechanism to assist with the decision-making process of the executive government. Members of both the House of Representatives and Senate are eligible to serve as ministers and Parliamentary secretaries. A minister does not have to be a member of either house. But Section 64 of the Constitution of Australia requires the minister to become a member within 3 months. The Prime Minister and Treasurer are traditionally members of the House of Representatives. But the Constitution does not have such a requirement. As amended in 1987, the Minister of State Act 1952 permits up to 30 ministers as Mem.